Right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Ignatius Jean, and welcome to our CAWASA Wednesday webinar. And this is webinar number 14 of 2026. This afternoon, our guest is an environmental practitioner from Grenada with extensive experience supporting climate resilience, biodiversity conservation, and ecosystem management initiatives across the Caribbean. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Marine, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology, a diploma in project management, and is currently pursuing a master's in integrated coastal and oceans management, which underpins his strong technical foundation and ability to support effective project implementation. His professional background includes environmental impact assessment, baseline studies, environmental monitoring, quality assessments, and vegetation surveys, with a strong emphasis on applied field conservation. I will not continue with, here's a very extensive professional biography, but we will continue in the interest of time. I now would like to welcome Mr. Kendon James, who is now based at St. George's University. Over to you, Mr. James.
Good day again. Let me just share my screen. Please let me know if you're seeing my screen.
Let's see. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we are. Yes, we are.
Okay, excellent. Right. So good afternoon again, and thank you very much to the CAWASA team, the Caribbean Water and Sewage Association, and also Operators Beyond Borders for the invitation. As would Mr. Ignatius would have pointed out, my background is not in utilities management, not in water hydrology systems, but rather in environmental conservation and climate adaptation. But over the years, what I've noticed is that I come to appreciate that there are pretty much many challenges facing our natural environments that are pretty much similar to the challenges facing water utilities. So today I'd like to explore how activities occurring in our forests, watersheds, our communities, and our rivers and coastal ecosystems ultimately affect the availability and the quality of water, and also the long-term water security throughout the Caribbean. Now, as before I go ahead, we're going to look at pretty much water security. What is water security? Understanding watersheds, the ridge to reef connection, environmental drivers of water security, climate change and water security, lessons learned from Grenada, and looking at as well the nature-based solutions and partnerships. So when thinking about water scarcity, one might think, what determines whether a customer receives safe drinking water? Most people would probably say the treatment plants, the reservoirs, pumps, pipes, but the answer starts much earlier than that. It really starts in the forests, the rivers, the wetlands, the watersheds, rainfall patterns, and the coastal ecosystems. Water utilities manage infrastructure, but the environment determines the quality and quantity of water entering that infrastructure. Now, as we go into the water security aspect of things, when we think about water security, we often focus on as mentioned, the infrastructure. However, those assets are absolutely, while those assets are absolutely critical, water security actually begins when we look at sufficient water, safe water, reliable water, and resilient water systems. Now, having enough water available and maintaining acceptable water quality while delivering water reliably and thus ensuring systems remain resilient during shocks and disasters. The environment influences every one of those factors. In many ways, environmental conditions determine how hard utilities have to work to deliver safe drinking water. And I'm sure much of you here could attest to that. In fact, we have a saying in Grenada, usually when water or when rain is falling very heavily, that's when our system crashes. And people always tend to kind of question why is that the case? But it's just plain and simple. The water utilities are not adeptly prepped for these shocks. So we then find cases of siltation and having to put in extra work to treat that water. And all of that is based on the conditions of our environment, the conditions of our watersheds. Now, how watersheds support water security? Firstly, we want to ask, what is a watershed? Now, according to NOAA, a watershed is an area of land that channels rainfall, in this case, snowmelt, which we don't have in the Caribbean, and runoff into a common body of water. Now, as this visual here shows, we have rain falling up in the mountains. Now, as that rain precipitates into the forest, it then heads down, takes the time, heads down into the streams, and it flows throughout the body of the land. Now, it's important to note, the trees are super important in that they actually help slow the water and allows for the water to infiltrate the soil, thus charging our natural aquifers and providing a lot of the groundwater systems. However, we also have the water flowing throughout the rivers and then maintaining that steady flow. In this case here as well, we have the watershed boundary demarcated, and that's generally the area which would funnel the water into that general basin. So when I think of a watershed, I usually think of it as a bowl. The watershed boundary being the edge of the bowl, and the volume or the inner sections of the bowl being the watershed. So this key piece of graphic here illustrates how our watersheds captures the rainfall, it promotes the infiltration, and as well recharge the groundwater systems, but also ensures that we have enough surface water runoff that flows into our streams, ensures agriculture, farmers get sufficient water for their crops and livestock, ensures also persons get enough water to bathe and do other activities. And most importantly, it ensures that there's sufficient water for the biodiversity that relies on said water systems, such as our crayfish, crabs, fish, and trees. Now, water utilities benefits heavily from a proper functioning watershed because a healthy watershed acts as a natural treatment and storage system. So with that, the water utilities would then have, in theory, less work to do, less man hours, less input to ensure that safe, reliable drinking water reaches the relevant stakeholders. Now, what happens when watersheds are degraded? Such degradation could include deforestation, quarrying, poor agricultural practices, and urban development. Now, when forests are removed or landscapes are heavily modified, the system changes dramatically. Rainfall moves faster across the landscape because there are no trees in place to actually slow the flow of water. Thus, you have less water infiltrating the soil. Then you have that knock-on effect where with less water infiltrating the soil, you have less groundwater. So the groundwater levels would decline, and streams may experience higher flow during storms, but lower flow during the dry season period. So as denoted in this image here, which was taken from NAWASA's Facebook, NAWASA Grenada, so that's the National Water and Sewage Authority. This was this year, where dam, I think it was the Les Avocats Dam, showed severe decline in our levels. Now, given that rain is falling, these levels are intended to go up. However, this was roughly mid-April, and you can see how severely drained this dam is. And this dam supplies roughly, well, quite a number of communities with water. So while rainfall totals may remain similar throughout the period, the availability of water throughout the years becomes less reliable, as we've been seeing. So this creates additional challenges for utilities attempting to manage increasingly variable water supplies. So less water available, as mentioned, you have more pressure on the reservoir, more pressure on the ecosystems and biodiversity within those streams, rivers, and lakes for survival. So you have competing interests then of the different stakeholders. Farmers complaining for water for their crops and their livestock. I mean, we don't hear the crabs and the shrimp and the fish complain, but we see the results of it through scarcity in catches from persons who rely on that service to make a bread for their livelihood. We also see persons within neighboring communities complaining for water and reliable water, of course, but also clean drinking water. And then we have the competing interests sometimes between sectors, where tourism makes up a large volume of water dependence. So you have hotels relying heavily on the water provided by the national utilities, water utilities, and we have then the community members or community groups, in some cases being starved out of water. So now the water utility companies have to manage and balance all of that. So this important concept here, or system, the reach to reef approach, is pretty much looking at it or zooming out and looking at it from that wider lens where everything is connected, land and sea. Now, the rich reef concept recognizes that everything in a landscape is connected. Rain falls on the ridge or up in the mountains, and it flows through the forests, through the communities, and eventually that reaches the coast. Now, whatever happens at the top of the system influences everything downstream. So if forests are healthy, rivers are often healthy. If erosion increases upstream, utilities companies, or the water utilities in this case, see increased turbidity in their systems. And with increased turbidity, it also comes with increased time, increased man hours being put into the system, increased costs for filters, backwash, all of that. Then generally you would then have less output because a lot of that water is being spent to actually get clean water. On the other hand, if you have clean water or relatively clean water coming into the system, then the wastage or the water that gets out into the community is generally much greater, larger volumes. And that's besides the losses through broken lines and through broken lines. So if erosion, as mentioned earlier, increases, this sediment also reaches the sea and it impacts our mangrove systems within the coastal areas. It also impacts our coral reef and later down impacts the entire coastal ecosystem. Coastal ecosystem in this case would suffer. And we would see later on how that impacts water security. So it's important to note there's no real separation between the land and sea. It's very interconnected. So rather than viewing these as separate systems, we need to understand them as one interconnected system. So now, why coastal ecosystems matter? Many operators may ask, what do corals have to do with my utility? The answer in this case is a lot. At first glance, coral reef and mangroves may seem unrelated to water utility operators, and in some cases, unrelated to water security. However, these ecosystems provide critical protection for coastal communities and infrastructure. Mangroves help reduce flooding and trap sediments. By extension, coral reef help reduce incoming waves into our shores and protect shoreline from erosion. Now, when these ecosystems are degraded, communities become more vulnerable to storms and coastal hazards. For instance, in the community of Telescope and in Grenville, in Grenada, there is a extent of coral reef, fringing coral reef that was destroyed to allow for passage into the harbor for commercial purposes. Now, after the degradation of this coral, or the blasting of the coral back in the 1980s, that allowed for heavy or stronger waves entering the coastal area and stronger waves reaching our shores. Now, these waves pretty much enter the system, and by extension, Grenville is prone to a lot of flooding. A lot of the cases, these flooding allow for lots of the time roads to be blocked off, flooding of the sewer systems in the area, flooding of the businesses, and the cleanup efforts are ginormous. Lots of water is needed to actually ensure that the streets are clean and sanitized from, in some cases, sewage. A lot of times, persons lose a lot of their livelihoods because of these activities. So by extension, the water that we were supposed to pretty much take for normal drinking and cleaning processes is stretched thinner by the process of having to clean after an event such as flooding due to waves from the ocean, waves from the sea coming into land. So looking at that from that perspective, we're already stressed, our systems are already stressed, but because of the effects of the degradation of coral reef, and in this case, I mentioned the active degradation or blasting of the coral reef. But in most cases, coral reef naturally die because of sedimentation being flushed onto the reef because of poor land management practices. Same sedimentation that usually silts up our dam, same sedimentation that usually have our systems down for loads of man hours. So looking at it from that holistic point of view, where the system is being stressed on land, and with that, you have stress being endured on coral reef at sea, which in turn adds additional stress to the system because of the flooding in coastal areas. So water security connection, in this case, healthy coastal ecosystems strengthen the community resilience. Now, I would have mentioned a little on the sedimentation aspect. And in this case, I have sedimentation, a hidden cost. Now, as we look at sedimentation, one of the most significant consequences of watershed degradation is sedimentation. Sedimentation by itself is when vegetation is removed and soil becomes exposed. And as rain naturally falls onto the ground, this soil becomes suspended within the water column, and it usually silts up our water infrastructures, our treatment plants, but also it reduces the volume our reservoirs, our lakes can actually carry. So over time, you have sediments lining the borders of our lakes, and this in turn causes reeds as the pioneer species to come in, and then more siltation occurs. And with this siltation, eventually land forms, and then eventually you may have a massive lake, and within 10, 20 years, over that decade or so lifespan, you have the reduction in the volume of water being stored. Hence, the volume of water entering the water utility systems is significantly reduced. So you then have to manage this small volume of water under the multitude of challenges that were already there. So, as mentioned, when the vegetation is removed, the heavy event washes that soil into the streams and rivers. And for a lot of the persons or stakeholders that rely on that water, such as the farmers and us as the users, sediment often appear as elevated turbidity within the system. And then the utility operators have to spend additional costs and time to ensure that the water is delivered safely and it's up to the standards of safe drinking water. A lot of cases, we complain as end users, of the quality, especially the color, because as mentioned earlier, almost every time when rain falls, you then tend to have your nice tall glass of chocolate tea that comes through your pipe, and no one wants that. So as more sediments increase, that increases filter maintenance. It also increases the operational costs, and the source of the problem may be miles upstream. but the consequences are often felt at the treatment plants and by extension, us, the end users. So in this case, sediments doesn't simply pass through the system. Over time, it accumulates. It accumulates in our reservoirs, in our dams, and in our intake structures. And as this sediment builds up, the storage capacity declines. And this particularly concerning in our small island development state systems. Because where capacity is already compromised, is already challenged by knock-on effects of climate change, high rates of evaporation, broken infrastructure due to lack of funding, and we always also have to deal with the issue of mismanagement or poor management of the resource. So in this case here, reservoir pretty much provide water security during drought may gradually lose its effectiveness as sediments accumulate. And this is an example of how poor watershed management can directly reduce water security. Now, moving on to climate change and Caribbean water security. Climate change here in this case is another layer of complexity that is added to the already stressed and strained water utilities management in the Caribbean. So across the Caribbean, we're seeing shifts in our rainfall patterns. Utility managers can no longer say, well, June is approaching, we should get some rain. Because in some cases, June, we're still in a dry season, as we've seen in Grenada back in 2024. We also see an increase in temperatures. So in this case, we have persons utilizing more water. People are generally would be drinking more water, and also the rate of evaporation is also higher. In some locations, they're experiencing longer dry periods, while others are seeing more intense rainfalls. There are also higher temperatures, and the result is greater uncertainty regarding water availability. So in this case, the availability, but also the water quality is compromised. Because in some cases, as mentioned earlier, with the sediment loads due to climate events and also nutrient runoffs, but you also would have contamination risk and sewage overflow in the event that you have heavy rainfall. Additionally, stronger storms and hurricanes puts stress on the ecosystem and infrastructure, where it may cause a lot of damage to our trees, our watersheds, our built infrastructure such as our dams, our reservoirs, and it also may cause contamination of our water source. And with the event of sea level rise, you then have saltwater intrusion and increased frequency of equipment maintenance. So in Grenada, we usually have the saying, once we actually, well, in cases where we have brackish water being introduced in the system, we usually call it boil water. And that is probably one of the worst tasting water, in my opinion, and the opinions of many. And as sea level tends to rise, then we'd have the mixing of our natural aquifers with seawater, which would then cause that brackish water taste in our systems. Now, climate change affects not only the quantity, as mentioned, but also the availability. So more intense rainfall events increase the runoff from roads, farms, and urban areas. These events trap sediments, nutrients, pollutants, and debris into the watercourses. Water quality can change rapidly during those events and major rainfall events. So then utility operators may need to adjust treatment processes to more frequently and respond to changing sources of water conditions with little warning. In this case here, we have an excavator clearing out one of the dams in Grenada, and you can see the quantity, the volume of sediment that is in here. Now, when we look at the nature-based solutions, in this case, I have a case study of Taro village in Dominica. We're looking at solutions geared towards increasing the resilience of our natural ecosystems. And nature-based solutions are gaining increasing attention globally. These approaches use natural systems to address environmental and social challenges. Now, examples of such solutions include reforestation, riparian buffers, wetland restoration, and mangrove rehabilitation. Now, while they are not replacement for the engineered infrastructure, they can complement traditional approaches and provide multiple benefits simultaneously. So in this case here, we have the Taro village in Dominica, where Vetiver TT, being the implementing agency, would have come in to address the issue of land degradation due to the introduction of the invasive lemongrass, which was used to supplement animal fodder. And over time, the grass spread uncontrollably, contributing to soil erosion, reducing biodiversity, and also increasing wildfire risk because of its high flammable nature. Now, these challenges threaten both the environmental and the livelihood of the community. So to restore the landscape, Vetiver TT implemented a nature-based solution approach centered on effective water management and slope stabilization. So in this photo here, we have the coconut mats that were used to stabilize the soil, and planted within the coconut mats were vetiver grass, but also we have contour drains that were used to slow the water. And additional to the contour drains, we had the water steps, which also provided additional water slowing capacity. So in this case here, we had over 150 contour drains and step-down drains to help slow the runoff and also reduce erosion. And this increased water infiltration as well, because that allowed for the water more time to actually seep into the soil. Now, the coconut matting technology was an additional means of protecting the drains and the exposed soil, while the vetiver grass, because of its excellent rooting capabilities, was planted as hedgerows behind them. So now with the deep rooting system, vetiver acts as a natural living barrier, as well as it stabilizes the slope, but also it traps the sediments and slows the water movement. And it allows for more fire resistance than the invasive lemongrass. Now, the project also focused on long-term ecosystem recovery and community resilience. So a food forest, in this case here, was being established to replace the invasive vegetation, but it also improves the biodiversity within the area and ultimately provides sustainable food resource and acts as a fire break using the succulent cactus, in this case, while also a gravity-fed rainwater harvesting system was implemented to supply water during the dry season. So with this nature-based technology, we then have that transformation of a degraded hillside due to the introduction of an invasive species into a more resilient, productive, and environmentally friendly and sustainable landscape, thus improving the watershed, also improving the water availability and reliability within the village of Taro, Dominica. Now, without communities, because I've mentioned a lot about the water utility operators, but water utility operators cannot manage watersheds alone. It's virtually impossible. So communities play a critical role in watershed health and management because they naturally and regularly influence the land use, pollution, watershed health, and conservation within their systems. So many of these activities affecting water resource occur at the community level, whether through land management practices, conservation efforts, pollution prevention, or restoration initiatives. Community influence the condition of the watershed. And in so saying, community engagement is critical. So as water utilities management or managers, you then have to interface a lot with the community groups. And in some cases, the watershed may not necessarily be owned by governments, or it may not necessarily be public or crown lands. So you then have to work even more closely with the landowners of those watersheds. Now, what can utility operators do in management of these watersheds and ensuring water security? So for the immediate actions, we have support watershed monitoring, participate in watershed planning, and this planning here should be holistic, engaging the communities. And then also we have incorporating the climate and environmental risk into planning these processes. So that comes under the medium-term actions. So you also want to support restoration projects. So restoration of our riparian buffers, restoration of our watersheds, planting trees, and also strengthen the partnerships that are already there through NGOs, civil society, community-based organizations, etc. Long-term actions we may want to look into is invest in nature-based solutions because they address more than one issue and also promote the integrated watershed management, looking at that holistic form of management. So now in summary, I'll close with this thought. Water treatment plants do not create water security. They depend on it. The forests, rivers, wetlands, mangroves, reefs, and communities that make up our ridge-to-reef systems are not separated from water infrastructure. They are part of the water infrastructure. By protecting and managing these natural systems, we strengthen the resilience of our utilities, our communities, and our Caribbean region. Again, climate change amplifies existing risk, and the healthier an ecosystem is, the more able it is to support the resilience of our utilities. And lastly, the storage capacity depends on storage capacity depends on erosion and control. So in that, we then have to manage the amount of sediments that enter the system, and thus ensuring that our water systems are actually operating very effectively and efficiently. Again, thank you very much for the time, and I look forward to your questions.
Right. Thank you, Mr. James, for this very comprehensive presentation about the whole ecosystems around our water sector and why it is important to understand the nexus from ridge to reef. I think there are several participants here. Let's see if I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but please feel free, participants, to indicate whether you wish to make a comment, or you can proceed with that or put it in the chat room. Thank you. While we await some questions, I think that is so timely in terms of some of the challenges our water utilities are faced with at this moment. In many of the utilities, particularly those of us in the Windward Islands, St. Lucia and St. Vincent and Grenada, where the supplies are low because, well, the streams or the catchments are very low, and the utilities are struggling to find alternatives and having to do a lot of rationing by way of valving, and which creates additional other pressures on the systems. So this is quite timely in showing the relationships in how we maintain the environment. One of the things that you mentioned is that you have to have the communities supporting the utilities in managing those the catchments. But the other thing that's also have happened in several countries now is that the utilities are not they have been added now regulatory systems so that you have water resource management agencies who have been given responsibility for water source protection. Very often it is the communities still believe that the water utilities are still the ones who have to capture the water and also see about the forest reserves and all the other systems. But I think it is asking a lot of the utilities, and hence the reason why the governments have created a lot of these other agencies to assist with helping to assist with preserving the environment so that we can preserve the water systems. So I think those are good points you made. So we have some in the chat there now. I think Mr. Martinez says, in 2025, Mr. Terence Smith did a presentation at the last CAWASA conference, stating that there were 110 incidents of landslides clogging dams in Grenada. The area above the dams appear heavily forested and untouched. Has the exact cause of these landslides been determined?
So I cannot necessarily answer that question at this moment, but I can reach out to Mr. Smith to see whether or not there were evidence to show why exactly this had occurred.
Then we have from Kevin Carter. He says, great presentation. How would you assess the level of coastal water quality in the region? Is this an area of growth in the region? Water quality monitoring, as I think he meant.
Right. So we're actually seeing quite an increase in the degradation of water quality systems within our coastal areas. As we have more and more clearing of our mangroves for coastal development. In some cases as well, we have the reduction or the complete removal of our wetland areas. Then that then increases the volume of water as we know, wetlands naturally slow the volume of water that actually leaves the land and into the sea. So with this reduction and removal of those wetlands, we have greater and greater plumes of sediments that actually enter the coastal systems, and that puts additional stress and strain on our corals and the very few mangrove areas that we have within the Caribbean. And as I would continue to chant, the purpose and the value of mangroves are increasingly more and more uh, needed in our systems as we rely heavily on coastal ecosystems for protein source through food and tourism, which we have now made that shift in the last 2 or 3 decades. So, is there a growth in the region? What exactly um growth in what? In terms of the degradation of coastal environments?
Yeah, I think you were speaking of the coastal zones. And there's another question. Well, it's not a question. There's a comment that there's need for. He didn't. Person didn't think you mentioned uh, in the need for investing in education of communities regarding soil management and landscaping practices, as this affects watersheds.
Yes, most definitely. And thanks, Chrisma, for adding that. For sure, more educated we are as a people, more that we are on the same page in our conversations, I think the greater the resilience of our communities, and a stronger community ultimately results in a stronger nation and a stronger Caribbean. Because hence the reason why we can actually share our lessons learned and adapt with the changing environment.
So we have two hands raised there. I will first take Mr. Derwin Valley and then Mr. Gabriel Adewusu. Go ahead, Derwin.
Afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Mr. Shan. Great presentation, Mr. James. It's like it's almost in a 101. For persons like myself who's not into the particular scope, but into water and wastewater management. Just probably like two questions, and I stand to be corrected. Um, Mr. Jha talked about your informative climate adaptability. All right. Um, just a thought. If it is that you say climate adaptability, and with the summary of medium, short term, and long term goals, uh, realistically, what is the time frame regarding those, and if not being acted upon, what could be the worst case scenario? And again, from a professional, from yourself, and I know we could Google things, and there's other studies coming and saying this and that and the other question is another comment or one of the slides, I think the second to last slide, you said that climate change amplifies, I think, is the risk, or the situations or the risks concerning that. I know, it's a ticklish topic. So with that in mind, if you're saying that it amplifies, that means the problem's already there and it's already man-made, or for want of a better word, man's decisions. Um, it causes the problem, and the climate change amplifies it. If you could answer that clarify me on that.
So thank you very much for your questions. Just to follow up on the first question, I think it was looking at the timeline in terms of the implementation aspect of long-term versus
Short term
immediate.
and medium term.
Right. So in the case of immediate, those things pretty much should have been done like yesterday, last week. So we already seen the impacts of what a degraded watershed uh, system has on the utilities and has on our water security. So those actions need to be implemented ASAP. In the case of the medium term, on average, they're pretty much based on how quickly those things could be implemented. In fact, I would say, though I have immediate, medium, and long term, all of those are needed ASAP, as soon as possible. However, it's pretty much how quickly those systems could be mobilized. Within the Caribbean, we generally have shortage of resources, such as human capacity and funding. So conversations surrounding education, conversations surrounding partnerships, conversations surrounding community engagement, these things could be operationalized much faster than the other actions that falls within the medium and the long-term strategy. So that was my thought process in breaking it up in those sections. As it relates to the issue of climate change on the systems and whether or not those problems already existed, in most cases, yes. We we've been dealing with brackish water for quite some time. However, with the increase in sea level rise, we then have greater chances of encountering brackish water. It actually moves further up the aquifer stages. So, and in cases where we have um, droughts and heavy rainfall, we've been dealing with that before as well. But in this case, with the additional pressure of climate change, we then have increased frequencies of droughts. We may have longer periods of drought. We may have increased rainfall and storm, which then puts additional pressure on our natural and man-made infrastructure. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay,
That
Mr.
was good. Yes.
Gabriel, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Hi, yeah, good afternoon. So just commending you, excellent presentation. I liked the angle about the community engagement, the partnering with communities to address these issues. Coming from UNICEF, I just also wanted to emphasize the need to engage children and young people, particularly in these areas. We know that, they are the future. And I have seen programs in some of the Caribbean countries that engage children through very practical exercises that enable them understand these concepts and therefore supports the work in protecting our ecosystems. So just wanted to highlight that and say great job. Thanks and over.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriel. We have a comment in the chat or question from Nicole George. Alternative water treatment like desalination production, is it an option as a solution? Maybe we can look at making the production cheaper.
Yes, for sure, desalination is an option, but again, it has to be coupled with solutions such as renewable energy. But also, if your watersheds are not managed properly, then the process of desalination almost becomes futile because you have more and more contamination present in the water. Aside from just removing the salt from the water, you have to ensure that there are additional steps to remove the additional impurities that are now present in the water, such as maybe heavy metals, oils, nutrients, etc. So there are options. Desalination is an option for sure, but it has to be coupled with still proper watershed and land management practices.
Right. We have we see Mr. Dr. Adrianus Vlugman. Don, go ahead.
Yeah, good afternoon. My camera. Congratulations with your excellent presentation. And it is very timely and a very important topic you addressed. I want to address also the desalination issue and water quality monitoring. Desalination fulfills the role not only to amend limited water supply during droughts, but also to augment water quality and to basically you can blend water, ground or other surface waters with desal water so that increases or reduces the pollution load and increases the quality, especially for nitrates in groundwater or if you have saline intrusion, you can use desal water to reduce the contamination load. Desalination will not be the full solution. I mean, you cannot replace all the existing water supplies, but it has a function of increasing water quality for human consumption. But thank you very much. It's a very, very interesting presentation. I will adjust my camera another time. Sorry for that.
It's okay. Right. Thank you very much for that input there.
Sorry, I was muted. Just checking the chat. I don't see any others at this point, but I think yes, as I said earlier, I think that was quite timely given the period that we were in, where our utilities are severely challenged in finding alternative sources. And I think the suggestion about desalination, we are large ocean nations, and I think the time has come we have to seriously give consideration and looking at these options that are available to us, because it seems that the patterns that are happening now with this season it's El Nino and the sort of challenges it presents. Even we're supposed to be at the start of the rainy season and we still yet to receive the rains, and how much storage of the raw water supply that we have, and the impact of environmental degradation on storing that water during the wet period. So these are serious considerations that we must have going forward. And as we have increasing demand on the water supply and what is available for production, just this week we have a training program going on in St. Lucia with Global Support and Development using an AR6 water treatment system, just as a sort of emergency system where we may have little trickles of water and where you cannot have enough to pump to your major systems, that you may still be able to make a little bit of water available in the communities. But that's for another show. We're going to have a special presentation on that training session going on this week. But I just thought I should mention it. So I'd like to thank you again so much, Mr. James, and wish you very well with your studies to your master's program at St. George's University.
Oh, it's actually at the University of Trinidad and Tobago.
Oh, my apologies.
Yes, it's okay.
All right. Yeah, so thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. This was webinar number 14, CAWASA Wednesday webinar. We'd like to also thank the Operators Without Borders for finding us, Mr. Kendon James.
Yeah,
and Kevin Carter for joining us from the CWWA branch of the CWWA in the Florida section, and all of you faithful who join us on a Wednesday afternoon. See you soon. Have a good evening. I'm Ignatius, Executive Director at CAWASA, signing off. Have a good one. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.